Welcome to Chapter 17, where we're going to be talking about ecosystems and their communities. Ecosystems, just to give you a definition, are a community of biological organisms plus those non-living components, which, if you remember from the last chapter, I did give you those terms, but we will see those terms on the next slide as well. So biotic and abiotic factors. So what does an ecosystem look like? Well, it can be something that you would immediately think of when you think of an ecosystem, from tropical forest to maybe a lush nature scenery, maybe a rotting log with mushrooms covering it, and all kinds of ferns, and all the little critters crawling around inside of it, maybe some beetles and things, to even the back of a beetle and the various things that cover the back of the beetle, such as parasites or other detritus covering it as well. So, ecosystems can be a wide range of things that encompass biotic and abiotic things within a community. An ecosystem is going to be made up, like I said, of biotic and abiotic or physical parts of an environment. So, biotic will include things like the community, which are going to be all living organisms within an area. And the physical or abiotic are going to refer to anything that is non-living within the habitat. So think rocks or sand or water, that kind of thing. The things that we want to keep in mind too within an ecosystem is going to be the input and output of an ecosystem. So tracing the flow of energy through the system itself, because it is quite literally a system. We want to focus on the relationships within an ecosystem as well, and we'll talk about the harmful versus helpful relationships as we move through this chapter. As we start talking about ecosystems, we want to start from much more broad scale and then get a little bit more focused. So we are going to begin with a very broad term, and that is a biome. Biomes are going to be very large ecosystems that occur around the world, and we typically will classify a biome as being either aquatic or terrestrial. That is how broad these terms are going to be. And then we're going to again get more specific. So a biome is going to be a geographic area of water or land. And like I said, there's aquatic or terrestrial. And typically the terrestrial are going to be defined by temperature and precipitation. So how much rainfall or snowfall is going to occur. Aquatic biomes are going to be classified by salinity and temperature and flow and a few other things. One of the other defining qualities of a terrestrial biome is going to be these four questions that we see on the screen here. So we have, what is the average temperature? What is the average precipitation? Is the temperature relatively constant or does it vary seasonally? And then the same for precipitation. Is it relatively constant or does it vary seasonally? So let's go into what are the specific kinds of terrestrial and aquatic biomes. There are 9 terrestrial biomes. They are classified by their temperature, their average temperature, and their average precipitation. So what we see is tropical forest, deserts, savannas, temperate grasslands, temperate deciduous forest, cheripoles, coniferous forest, tundras, and polar ice, which you might be thinking, but Rachel, ice, isn't that water? Technically, yes, but we're classifying it as a terrestrial biome because there is rock underneath that ice. So bear with me, guys. You'll notice on the map there that we have a color coordination for each of these terrestrial biomes, and that's pretty neat. It's a pretty cool little map there, in my opinion. So moving on, we will talk about the aquatic uh, biomes next. There are 5 aquatic biomes, so a little bit easier, and they make a lot of sense. We are going to classify these aquatic biomes by their salinity, which is their salt concentration, water movement, and depth. So we have lakes and ponds, which are going to, of course, be typically freshwater, rivers and streams, again, mostly freshwater, estuaries and wetlands, again, typically freshwater, and then open oceans, which are going to be typically saltwater, almost always saltwater, and coral reefs, also saltwater. And you can see that based on just that little bit of map that we have of the United States and Canada and Mexico, that we can see for the most part that most of the world is covered in open ocean is going to be the vast majority of our aquatic biome. That is the most abundant of our aquatic biome. So when we talk about these different biomes, terrestrial and aquatic, we are talking about temperature typically and precipitation. And we want to focus next on what is going to cause the different temperatures and precipitations, as well as water movement within these different biomes. Why and what causes all of that? So, to answer that question of why and what, we're going to need to understand that, thankfully, to Aristotle, the earth is round. So, if you argue that, I guess that's your prerogative. But the science seems to check out, and the Earth is in fact round. So, with that being the case, the curvature of the Earth is going to cause differences in rain and temperature around the globe. Likewise, it's going to be the reason that as we travel closer to the equator, it's going to feel hotter because it is hotter. Or as you move further from the equator towards the poles, the temperature is going to get colder. So the reason that this happens is because the sun is going to be much more directed, or solar energy is going to be much more directed at the equator, kind of concentrated in a way, and just kind of beam down right at the equator, very concentrated in one area. Okay, it's very direct. Meanwhile, as you are at the poles, the Earth's curve is going to essentially spread the sunlight out. And you can see the way that this picture is showing, it is spreading the light across the curve of the Earth, as opposed to where we see it on the equator, hitting the equator. It is just that one central beam hitting that middle of the Earth. So when you're at the poles, that light is spread, kind of like just spread right out. So what happens with that curve of the Earth and that light spreading out is the heat is essentially dispersed in such a way that it is not very warm. And that is why it's colder at the poles and warmer at the equator. And because of this differentiation of dispersal of heat, that is what is going to cause these circulation patterns, creating deserts and rain and forest. And it has to do with the distribution of solar energy and how it hits the Earth due to the Earth being round. It's really kind of interesting, very cool. Has everything to do with the Earth being a globe. Neat. Now, just as we can see why um, the distribution of solar energy causes temperatures to be a particular way in various spots on the earth, we can also see how rain is formed due to temperature. So we are just going to keep this whole temperature train rolling and keep talking about why temperature and how temperature does what it does in weather making on our planet. So, one of the big important things that we're going to get across here, real quick, is that warm air is going to hold moisture. This is very important in understanding rainmaking. So, warm air holds moisture, cold air drops it like it's hot, which is kind of a silly thing for me to say. Let me rephrase that. Warm air holds onto moisture, cold air releases moisture. Okay? Warm air clings to moisture, cold air drops moisture. So, when rain is formed, okay, we are forming the rain, if you will. Air that is going to be warm, that is holding moisture, holding water, is going to rise up into the atmosphere. And as it goes into the atmosphere, rising up, it's going to start to cool because as it gets further away from the surface of the earth, it gets colder. So, up in the atmosphere where it's nice and chilly, it is going to chill that air. And because cold air wants to release moisture, it's going to drop the moisture. So, it drops the moisture, and that is what rain is. It is that cold air dropping water. Isn't that neat? Super cool. So, that is kind of leading us to the fact that the equator is very hot, and we know this. The equator is very warm. We just saw that on the last slide because of solar energy absolutely beating down directly at the center of the earth, that equator line, right? But the other thing that's really interesting about the equator is not only is it hot, it's also very wet. So, that is why at the equator you have a lot of rain, a lot of rainforest. That term should make a lot of sense now. So the equator is hot, meaning you have a lot of hot air rising with that water, going into the atmosphere, cooling, and then dropping back down. So you have a lot of rain, which is very good. We like that solar energy. We like that rain. At the equator, we're going to have a ton of biodiversity. So, our next natural step is to talk about desert formation. So, instead of tons of rain, we're looking at essentially areas where moisture is sucked out of the environment. And this happens quite literally in that capacity. So, again, warm air is going to hold moisture and that cold air is going to drop moisture. So here we have cold air, which is going to be heavier than warm air, and it begins to fall downwards toward the earth and is warmed by heat radiated off the earth's surface. And as the air gets warmer, it can hold more and more moisture rather than releasing it as rain. So, in fact, the falling and rapidly heating air can hold so much moisture that it sometimes absolutely just sucks up moisture from the land itself. And that is where we get deserts, which is just wild and crazy. And where we see a lot of, and I'm going to say this very specifically, hot deserts, is about 30 degrees north and south of the equator. So that red strip that we see on that illustration of the Earth, that is where we have more of those warm or hot deserts. So very little rainfall because we're sucking the moisture out of the land there. Now, you can have cold or frozen deserts as well. There's very little rainfall, but it's just not hot. And we see those at the poles. So not at that 60-degree north and south line, but just above that. That is going to be where we see the poles. Those are also going to be where we have deserts as well. And that is because we still have essentially no rainfall. It's just that there is warm air and absolutely no moisture is able to be dropped. Kind of wild. So, moving on to how weather can be influenced by topography. Topography is going to just be physical features of the land. And when we talk about topography, this can be anything from mountains to buildings, even. It doesn't necessarily have to be something natural, it can also be something man made. So when we look at the topography and how it can affect uh, how the weather is created, we look at elevation. So when we have increased elevation, this causes the air pressure to drop, and because the weight of the altitude decreases, pressure will decrease, which means temperatures decrease. So kind of interesting how that relates. Now, what's I think a little bit more interesting, in my opinion, when we look at topography, we look at something called a rain shadow. So rain shadows are going to be created by mountain ranges, and how you can go from having some type of body of water and then a mountain range, and then on the other side of that mountain range, we're going to have a desert. This is not always how it goes, but this is pretty frequent. What we have going on is essentially clouds not being able to make their way over this mountain, if you will. The water within the clouds themselves drop before it can go over the mountain. So the water is released because it is cold, because remember, cold air is going to drop water. And by the time it gets over the top of the mountain, there is no water to be dropped, but we have warm air now. And what that warm air is going to do is, of course, suck the moisture out of the land, because we see that when it comes to deserts. And that is what we're going to see here with a rain shadow desert, especially. So, a good example of kind of picturing a rain shadow desert, if you're like, I've never seen this before in my life, if you've ever seen the movie Holes, that is a rain shadow desert. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go have a watch. You'll see what I'm saying. Human engineering has been shown to affect weather, especially like local weather, of course, to the point that it can be kind of a bit of a problem. So in city areas, we see things like urban heat islands due to asphalt, cement, and buildings absorbing heat and raising the temperatures to the point that cities will be 1 to 6 degrees warmer than surrounding rural areas, which can be a bit of a problem depending on what the actual temperature is. From there, in areas that have very tall buildings, especially when it comes to more dense cities, a good example is Chicago, wind is able to more strongly move at higher altitudes because it's not running into anything. So imagine, no traffic, you'd be zooming, right? So that is kind of how the wind is moving higher up, kind of in the atmosphere, right? So imagine the wind is cruising along nice and quickly, and then it runs into a skyscraper. Well, this tall building will then channel that wind downward. But the thing is when that gust of wind hits the building, it is then deflected and pushed down, and that speed is then doubled, sometimes tripled by the time it reaches street level. So these downward wind gusts end up being substantially stronger than the original gust of wind that was at the top of the building, which can be pretty dangerous, and kind of just a completely human engineered weather factor. It's just pretty wild. Now, on top of every other factor that we have talked about, that affects the weather, we also have to talk about the ocean, because the ocean also affects the weather in the fact that water holds heat a lot stronger than air can. In fact, water holds 10,000 times more heat than air can. So warm water will warm the climates of the areas that currents move that warm water into, which is pretty wild, that it can do that. But let's talk about it. So water is always moving and mixing, and we can see that in this ocean circulation pattern map of the world. And so these currents are moving and mixing water that is warm and cold at any given point in time. So what causes this moving and mixing is going to be wind, Earth's rotation, gravitational pull of the moon, temperatures, and salinity, actually as well. So all of these create several of those large circular patterns of flow that we see and call ocean currents. And then again, those ocean currents are going to affect the climate of the areas that they move into. So the Gulf Stream is going to be one of the most notorious for causing a change in the climate as it moves from the Caribbean up the east coast of the United States and across the Atlantic Ocean towards Europe. So as it begins in a warm part of the globe, close to the equator, because again, remember the equator is going to be the warmest area of Earth, it is still warm by the time it reaches the east coast of the United States and then Europe. That warm water is also going to warm those areas. And in fact, if it weren't for the Gulf Stream, much of Europe, given the higher latitudes, would have a climate more like Canada's. And because all ocean currents in the northern hemisphere rotate in a clockwise direction, water reaching the beaches of California, unlike water reaching East Coast beaches, has just come from the north near Alaska, where it gets very cold. All right, guys, I love talking about El Nino. It is arguably one of the neatest weather abnormalities that we're going to talk about. And it's actually the only weather abnormality we're going to talk about. But either way, so what is El Nino? Well, it's not Spanish for the Nino, but it is actually Spanish for little boy. And it was named by South American fishermen who noticed periods of unusually warm water in the 1600s, and they would notice it around Christmas time. So it was actually named, the full name of El Nino is El Nino Navidad. So you probably know the term Navidad from Feliz Navidad. Navidad means Christmas. So it's little boy Christmas is what it's referencing. So kind of a neat little backstory of why El Nino is called El Nino, because it happens typically in December. So, in order to talk about why El Nino conditions are odd, we need to talk about what the usual conditions are. So, the usual conditions, um, we're focusing on the Pacific Ocean, mind you, and specifically from South America to roughly Southeast Asia, Australia. So, if you look at the left side of the illustration we've got going on, we're going to look at those usual conditions first. So, what we have going on is where wind is going to push this warm water towards Australia, in Southeast Asia, from South America. So we have South America being a little bit colder, as well as what's happening is the sea level is going to drop in South America as this wind is pushing the water away, okay? And what we're seeing on the other side in Southeast Asia / Australia is the sea level is rising, but we're also seeing this warm water arriving due to those winds. And what that means is with that warm water, we're having, because remember, warm water is going to increase the climate, right? Because that warm water is going to make the temperature rise, and therefore we're going to have rain. So we're going to have tropical rainstorms, which is super fun. But this is normal. We want this. This is a normal occurrence. After that, so that is the Southeast Asia, Australian side. That's the norm. On the South American side, what we see is from the cold water, we have cold water upwells from the depths of the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and from that cold water, you have cold, dry weather. So it's not really raining as much. And then that cold water is going to bring nutrients up from deep in the ocean, which is going to help the plankton populations flourish, which means that the fish populations are going to flourish as well. And that's going to be a good time for South American coastlines, and that is what we want. That is a good time. This is good. Now, what happens with El Nino is kind of the opposite, in a way, so to speak. So, what happens is every roughly 2 to 7 years, it starts a chain of kind of unusual global weather patterns. So, yes, everything I'm about to list happens, but on top of that, other things happen too around the world because this is happening as well. So a lot of other things are blamed because of El Nino, but this is also what is specifically happening with El Nino in this specific area that we've been talking about. So there is little to no wind pushing that warm water away from South America towards Australia and Southeast Asia. What that means is that the sea level in South America stays high, and those tropical rainstorms will happen in South America. Australia will stay cold as the water, as well as the temperature around Australia and the Philippines as well. The sea level will stay low as well, which is not necessarily a good thing. So from there, we have a bunch of rain in South America and droughts in Southeast Asia and Australia. Bad times. What this also means is that there's no cold water upwells along the coast of South America, meaning the plankton aren't flourishing and there's no fish. That's a super bad time. So that is what happens with El Nino, in case you ever hear that term again, when it comes to the weather, of course. There is also La Nina, which is kind of a counterpart of El Nino. It's sort of the opposite. Instead of warm water, you get more of a cold water draft. We won't go into it because I don't have any good pictures for that, but kind of a fun fact. We are officially moving away from the weather. And we're moving into how energy flows through an ecosystem, which is super fun. These are known as trophic cascades, and they have everything to do with how energy moves from one level to the next of consumers from a producer. So, starting with the sun, which is going to be that primary source of energy, it is going to be light being converted into chemical energy uh, through a producer. So, producers are going to use photosynthesis, which we're not going to talk about in any real emphasis other than this, and that is going to be how we convert light to energy. So, photosynthesis, if I could say it right, is light to energy, consumable energy, mind you. So, those are our producers, plants. From there, we have our primary consumers, which are going to be herbivores. Herbivores are going to be animals that eat exclusively plants. They're going to eat our producers. Our primary consumers are going to be eaten by secondary consumers, which are going to be carnivores. Carnivores are going to be animals that eat other animals, not always just herbivores, but they eat other animals, they eat meat. And then our tertiary consumers are going to be things like top carnivores that are going to be animals that eat other carnivores, but they'll also eat primary consumers as well. They'll eat everybody and anybody, anyone who's available. That's our tertiary consumers. And that is how energy is going to move from our sun and through our trophic cascade. Now, you'll notice that as we move through, that arrow starting from the sun gets smaller and smaller, and that is because as energy moves from the sun to our producer to our consumers, the amount of energy moving through each level becomes less. It's just, that's how it is. That is just how it goes. Now, a better way to show the relationships within an environment between the producers and the consumers is going to be through a food web, which is probably something that you're familiar with more than maybe a trophic cascade, which is perfectly fine. So, the food web is going to show how everybody interacts and the fact that it is not just a linear from start to finish, and that you can have multiple relationships between multiple players within the web. Now, from that last slide, we saw everybody eats, and in some capacity, uh, everybody dies. And also, something we need to talk about is everybody poops. So, what happens to all of that waste, both in things that are dead and rotting, as well as waste material that comes out of our bodies? Well, that is where we need to talk about Earth's recyclers. And these very important creatures are known as decomposers and detrivores. And there's a little bit of a difference. So detrivores are decomposers, but there is a difference. So decomposers include bacteria, fungi, and detrivores. Detrivores are going to be specific and include scavengers. And scavengers are important because they're going to be things like vultures and worms, arthropods, things that are going to consume dead things and be essentially like the garbage men of the natural world, so that you don't have just a bunch of bodies lying around just rotting about. These guys are so important to the environment. It's really unreal how disrespected they can sometimes be because of how much they are needed. So, what's important about decomposers like our bacteria and fungi is that as they begin to decompose various things, They release important chemical components from that organic matter that can then be recycled and used by plants and other producers in order to produce energy that can then be consumed by those primary consumers and then put back into that trophic cascade and our food web. So it's a really important cycle. All of these players are so very important to each other, and if you take one out, everything falls apart. All right, so what is necessary for life? Well, it's energy, which is what we've been talking about, and also some essential chemicals, which is also what we just talked about. But what chemicals are super important? Well, it's carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And it's important to note that we're going to find these three chemicals in a handful of areas within our ecosystem. And why are they important to us personally within our bodies, but where do we find them in our ecosystems? So we're going to talk about what that is, and that is a reservoir. So they are non-living components of an ecosystem that store those chemicals, and we're going to talk about where we find them. Carbon is the first chemical we're going to talk about, and that is going to be the chemical backbone of life on Earth. Everything you know and love is carbon. You are a fifth carbon, your body is, and carbon makes up everything. You breathe out carbon. It's all important carbon. And we find carbon in four very important places, but our carbon reservoir is going to be found mostly in our atmosphere. And that is the main important thing that I want you to get across uh, here, where carbon exists in our environment. Next, we have nitrogen. Nitrogen is an essential nutrient for the production of amino acids, which are going to produce proteins and nucleic acids. So this is important in producing DNA and RNA, as we talked about very early in the semester. I know that was quite a long time ago. And much like carbon, nitrogen is going to be found primarily in our atmosphere, also found a bit in soil, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's move on to our third and final chemical. Phosphorus is going to be found primarily actually in our soil compared to carbon and nitrogen. That is our primary ecosystem reservoir. So, why is phosphorus important? Well, I'm gonna try to drag out a memory from your brain from the beginning of the semester when we were talking about DNA, and specifically something that we find in our cells, and that is mitochondria. Mitochondria is going to produce ATP. ATP is energy. But what is ATP at its base? It's adenosine triphosphate, right? So phosphorus. So that is why phosphorus is so important in our bodies. So that's why that one's important. But let's talk about nitrogen and phosphorus and how too much of a good thing can actually be a bad thing. So fertilizers contain a lot of phosphorus as well as nitrogen that can be really beneficial short term, but in the long run, they can have really disastrous effects if used too much, too frequently, and especially at certain times. And we'll talk about why. So as you fertilize a lawn or maybe a golf course or a park or something in a large area, if you will, after it's been fertilized and maybe you have a big rain, or it rains for a few days, or you're just heavily watering this freshly fertilized area, what you're going to have is runoff. And that runoff is going to contain not just water, it's going to contain a lot of that fertilizer because Your grass or your lawn does not need every bit of phosphorus and nitrogen that is included in the fertilizer. So, of course, it's going to get washed away. Now, where does it wash to? Of course, it's going to wash off into water systems, so ponds, lakes, and rivers, where it is going to encounter algae and bacteria. Now, with the algae, we see algal blooms because, much like your lawn, algae is going to respond to the phosphorus and nitrogen in the fertilizer just the same way. It is going to enjoy that fertilizer and absolutely go gangbusters. What happens is it is going to then use up all of the oxygen in the water, and the same is going to go for bacteria. So the bacteria is going to enjoy the algae. So the bacteria is going to consume the algae and then go crazy too. Now, this is also going to consume oxygen in the water, which then suffocate the aquatic wildlife, and then we see death throughout our water systems. So we have this very sad dead fish in our picture here. So what we call this is eutrophication. So that is an important term to understand, especially when we're talking about preserving ecosystems. Your lawn is not so important that, this needs to happen. There is no lawn in the world that is important enough that we need to compromise water systems in this capacity. And I'll get off my soapbox here, but there it is. So moving on to something that I particularly enjoy when it comes to this chapter, and that is a niche. A niche is going to be a place within a community for a species. It's like a special job or a role that that species fills within that environment or within that community. It's a way of living, which is kind of a good, bad way of thinking about it. So the features of a niche is that it's a space an organism requires. It's the type and amount of food an organism utilizes, the timing of an organism's reproduction, an organism's temperature and moisture requirements, and other necessary living conditions, the organism for which it is a food source, its influence on competitors. And a good example is going to be that meme, and I'm sorry, it's kind of silly, but it is this creature known as Tiktaalik, and Tiktaalik was one of the first critters on Earth that climbed out of the water, and it filled that niche. It essentially evolved into being able to crawl onto land. Granted, this took many, many years before it actually developed something like feet, but that was an empty niche. Land existed. Every other organism was aquatic, and Tiktaalik ended up developing the ability to come onto land, which filled that niche, which was a role that was not previously filled, which is pretty cool. So hopefully that helps you understand what a niche is. So there are two kinds of niches. There's a realized niche, which is a narrow role that a species may occupy in a community at a given time, and then a fundamental niche, which is the full range of environmental conditions under which a species can live. The best way I can help you visualize these two concepts is to talk to you about the rats of Boston. Now, bear with me. Until the 1990s, the rats of Boston lived in relative peace in the sewers beneath the city's streets. Sounds dreamy, right? But when the city embarked on the largest underground highway construction up to that point in US history. Engineers ended up forcibly displacing and driving out thousands upon thousands of these poor rats from their habitat that they'd been living in for generations and generations. Can you imagine? And in essence, there was suddenly an overlap between the rats of Boston, their niche, and then the human niche. And the rats were now restricted to just some portions of the sewers because of that underground highway. As a result, the rats' realized niche, that narrower role, um, is now just a subset of their fundamental niche, that fuller range of environmental conditions which they can live from under which they can live. So when you think about these two terms, think about the plight of the poor Boston rats. I'm sure they're doing fabulous now because that was the 90s. But, at the time, not a good time for the Boston rats. So, what happens when niches overlap? So, kind of what happened with our Boston rats, we needed to sort some stuff out. And what ended up happening is the rats kind of had to concede to us, right? So, in a more uh, natural environment, what will happen is one of two things. Um, Competitive exclusion is the first, and it's going to be essentially a battle royale for resources, and there will be a distinct winner and a distinct loser, where the loser will typically go either locally extinct or completely extinct. It just depends on what we're talking about within the ecosystem and how big that niche actually is for those organisms, those species that are battling it out. The second is a little bit better if you're a peacekeeper like me, and that is resource partitioning. And that is where both species will alter and divide their resources. And essentially, the bottom line here is that sharing is caring, and then everybody wins. They alter what their niche is and their needs are so that both of them can survive in the same environment, which is pretty cool, in my opinion, as far as how adaptable the species need to become in order for both of them to survive in that instance when their niches overlap. So, talking about a relationship where everybody wins, let's talk about coevolution, and specifically coevolution of a pollinator in the form of a moth. I know it looks like a bird, but I promise it's a moth. Um, and an orchid in Madagascar. So, this is an example of coevolution where natural selection um, created this form of adaptation where this moth adapted to the orchid having a very long flower portion. So the moth is adapting to having a very long tongue. It's 11 inches long, which is pretty crazy. So these species are able to evolve together to help and serve each other's needs, which is pretty cool. So this is an example of coevolution. Coevolution does happen outside of species that help each other. In fact, it happens with predator and prey relationships. So, predators are a very strong um, evolutionary pressure for prey, but prey are also very good pressures for predators as well. They push each other, kind of like, uh, for lack of a better term, frenemies. So predators are going to push prey to evolve in such a way and adapt. to evade being eaten, while prey are going to push predators to be better at catching prey. So they do have this odd relationship together with this push and this pull. Um, so let's explore some of the ways that both will push each other to be better at what they do. Starting with prey, we are going to look at first the mechanical defenses. So, mechanical defenses, I want you to immediately think it's a physical structure that is going to be a protective physical feature. So, a good example is going to be like our little porcupine here. The quills are a great example to help physically protect it from predation. Other examples of mechanical defenses include claws, fangs, stingers, shells, other bodily armor. There's tons of examples of mechanical defenses, and these are just a few. Next, we have a chemical defense, and a chemical defense is going to include something like a toxin. Toxins are going to be an ingestible poison, such as with a poison dart frog. The other thing that comes with a chemical defense is usually what we're going to talk about next is going to be coloring. And we can see on our poison dart frog, our strawberry poison dart frog, that he is colored in such a way that makes him very clear what he is. He's not hiding with the background. He is very flashy, very showy, very look at me. I am what I am. I am a strawberry poison dart frog. This is to indicate to predators, don't you dare eat me. If you do, you're gonna regret it. You're gonna have a bad time. So when I talk about toxins, I do like to bring up the difference between something being poisonous and something being venomous, just as a gentle reminder to you, my lovely student, in case you ever go on Jeopardy or anything like that. And when it comes to something being venomous, I want you to now, and because you are probably watching this alone in the comfort of your home, make a V with your fingers. And then I want you to dig your two fingers after you've made a V into your arm. So V for venomous, and it looks like fangs digging into your arm. That is venom being injected, like from a snake, into your arm. That is venomous, as opposed to toxic or poisonous. Poison is going to be something that you ingest. So poison is like P for put it in your mouth, but don't put it in your mouth because it'll kill you. So, little side tangent. So, warning coloration was something we started to talk about with our strawberry poison dart frog. And maybe something you didn't know because you've never tried to eat a monarch butterfly, I hope, is that monarch butterflies are also toxic. So they have that beautiful orange coloring to warn predators that they should stay away because they are not safe to eat. So that warning coloration is going to go hand in hand with being poisonous and toxic. So, one of the neat things that animals have evolved to do is something called mimicry. Mimicry is an evolutionary ruse. It is what this little viceroy is doing. He is mimicking the monarch butterfly's coloring. So that is not a monarch, that bottom picture. That is a viceroy. And I'll be real, if you can tell the difference, there is that line that is coming down on the bottom part of the wing. That is what indicates a viceroy from a monarch. And, now you know. If you can't defend yourself physically, you can't defend yourself chemically, and you can't trick your predator into thinking you're somebody else that can do one of those things, then you gotta hide. So this is camouflage, also known as cryptic coloration. So we can see that with many animals, especially a praying mantis. Many animals are able to hide amongst their environment to avoid being detected by predators. So this is one of the ways that prey have been able to evolve to avoid being eaten. When all else fails, you can always act up. So behavioral defenses include hiding or escaping, so schooling fish as well as penguins and things like that will travel in groups to reduce predation. It may not save everybody, but it does decrease the risk of most if you are in a big group. And then the other thing that you can do as a prey species is to fight back. And you can do this by either alarm calling or by actually physically fighting back. So maybe using some type of mob technique, or like this fulmar, which is a type of seabird, it will projectile vomit to defend its nest. So just like we mentioned all of these ways that prey will evolve and adapt to evading becoming a meal, we also see predators adapting to become better at catching prey. For example, milkweed, which is a very important local plant that monarchs feed on, has evolved toxins to deter milkweed bugs from consuming it. Milkweed bugs then evolved resistance to said toxin. So what we see in predator-prey relationships is essentially an evolutionary arms race of kind of just evading and then catching and then evading and catching and just keeping upping the ante over and over. And then we have this hypothesis, the life dinner hypothesis, which explains that selection for escapability is stronger than the selection for capturability. And that is why we don't see predators adapting so well to catch prey that prey are consumed to extinction. And the reason that we see this is kind of an odd one. So kind of listen carefully here. So the cost of losing in a predator-prey interaction is much higher for the prey, right? Makes sense, because if in that predator-prey interaction, the prey loses the interaction, then they die. But if the predator loses, then the predator just loses a meal. If the prey loses, they don't live to have babies and to carry on their genetics. If the predator loses, they go hungry, but there's still opportunities to eat again, to have babies to continue their genetics. So that is the life dinner hypothesis. Kind of interesting. There it is. Frankly, guys, I'm not going to say a darn thing about this video. If you have the PowerPoint on your computer or on your phone, I would just say just go ahead and click on that link and just watch that video and enjoy. All right, moving on to one of my favorite types of predators, because they really, when you think about it, yes, of course they're a predator, but why didn't we think of it before as a predator until this class in this moment right now? Well, predators usually come in the form of something a lot larger than a itty bitty parasite, but parasites are in fact predators. And that is because they are forming this harmful relationship with their prey. So they form a symbiotic relationship, and instead of calling them prey, we call it a host. So you have two kinds of parasites, and we have an ectoparasite, which that first part is ecto, and that means outside. Now, this doesn't mean that these parasites just live outdoors. This means that the parasites are going to be found outside of the body. Ectoparasites are going to include things like bed bugs, lice, leeches, ticks, and mites, which, you can probably picture at least one or two of those. The other type of parasite is endoparasites. Endo means inside. These are going to be parasites that include roundworms, hookworms, heartworms, tapeworms, lots of worms, and flukes. There are tons of other kinds of endoparasites and ectoparasites, just we don't have all the time in the world to name them. Parasites are really interesting because they are the most numerous species on Earth, which really should just make your skin crawl. And another really weird fact about parasites is some parasites have parasites, which, ooh, what a bad day to be a parasite with a parasite. Now, you might be thinking, gosh, to be a parasite, what a dream. But it would come with some unusual challenges because typically parasites are going to be pretty small, which makes them an odd predator, of course. The other thing that's really weird about parasites is they have to stay in contact with their prey, which is their host, like direct contact, whether that is direct on their skin or directly inside of them. And then from there, they're living off of their prey, and typically they have to do it without killing them. Otherwise, there goes their meal ticket. The way that some parasites disperse as well is very odd. The one that I have on the screen, that is a tick, and he is doing something called questing. Questing is the way that ticks will disperse onto a host. They will climb to the end of either a stick or a blade of grass or maybe hay, whatever it may be, and then hold on with their back legs and then lift up with their front two legs like they're trying to get a nice big hug, and then wait for something to walk by and then cling to it. So that is how a tick will disperse itself onto an unsuspecting host. Other modes of dispersal are not always so adorable, and have sometimes a lot to do with their life cycles. It just depends on what terrifying parasite we're looking at. So if you want nightmares, look it up. Different life cycles of different parasites. Look up the dispersal and life cycle together, which can be really really horrible. And if you want to live with that, you're gonna wish you hadn't. But I warned you. Now, parasites are pretty wild in the way that they can affect their host. And these are a couple ways that they do it, or a couple examples of the ways some of these parasites can do that. So the first example that we have is parasites can induce foolish, fearless behavior in their host. The example we have is toxoplasma. Toxoplasma actually has two hosts. that they will enter into. The first host is going to be a rat. And what it does is it alters the behavior of the rat to, instead of its natural behavior of being afraid of cats, is it actually makes the rat attracted to cats. It turns off its fear and makes it want to go right up to a cat. Well, of course, cats don't think anything of that other than what a easy meal. And then the rat is typically eaten by the cat, and then thus the toxoplasma is entering into the second host. Pretty wild. The second way and second example we have of parasites affecting behavior is rabies, and that causes inappropriate aggression in a host. And you might be thinking, I thought rabies was a virus. It is. In fact, rabies is a virus that is a very old parasite, actually. They are the same. Dating back to about 2300 years BC in Babylon was when it was documented, jumping from dogs biting humans and humans getting rabies, which is pretty wild. So rabies can infect many vertebrate mammals, and more notoriously raccoons, skunks, foxes, coyotes, dogs, and be passed through saliva, typically by a bite, due to that aggression, which makes sense that rabies causes aggression because it's passed through spit, which is just terrifying. The last is causing a parasite that causes bizarre, risky behavior, and this is the lancet fluke. And the lancet fluke is a parasitic flatworm, um, and he's just kind of silly. Um, so what the parasitic fluke, what the lancet fluke does is it's known as the zombie maker, which is just great. So it has a very complex life cycle, and it's kind of one of the weird ones, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because it's a little nasty. But the first host that we have for this lancet fluke is a goat or a sheep. Then it is passed to a snail, and then it is found on grass or maybe something like hay or wheat or something like that. And then we are passed to an ant. The ant is the really important host because the ant is where the lancet fluke becomes the zombie maker. And it changes the behavior of the ant by infiltrating the ant's brain. It causes the ant to stick to the top of a blade of grass, where the ant will then be eaten by a grazing mammal like a goat or a sheep or a cow or something like that. And that's where that life cycle will then be completed, and the lancet fluke will then probably reproduce at that point. So pretty wild, those lancet flukes. So those are some really weird examples of parasites creating odd behaviors in their hosts. So kind of want to go over this just a little bit, but when we talk about parasites, it's not just a specific animal that we're talking about. What we're talking about when we talk about parasites, when we say the word parasite, is something that causes a relationship with a host, in that the parasite needs the host to live. So that's why we're including rabies as a parasite, even though rabies is also a virus. The lancet fluke is a flatworm, but it's a parasitic flatworm. So I hope that makes sense. Once again, we come to a video that you should just watch. I'm not going to say anything. Go ahead, click the ye old link there and enjoy the nightmares. Now, even after a breakup, you gotta know that not all relationships are bad. I don't want you to think that after the parasites, all relationships are bad. When we talk about relationships between species, we can have good ones. So mutualism is the best of the best relationships. That's where everybody wins. So when we look at mutualism, I want you to think of pollinators with the things that they pollinate. So, bees and flowers, that is a mutualistic relationship. The bee is getting something from the relationship, and the flower is also getting something from the relationship. They both benefit. Everybody wins. In a commensalism relationship, this is going to be a relationship where one of the parties is a winner, but nobody's a loser. The other party is going to kind of just exist, and that's their life. So in this example, what we've got is this cattle egret, and he gets to live on top of that buffalo. And that egret is eating insects off of the buffalo. You might think, well, wouldn't that help the buffalo in any capacity? Not really. It doesn't help. It doesn't harm. He's not bothered by the egret. He's not hurt by the egret, but it just is. So we have a winner, but there's no loser. It's not a bad relationship. Now, some relationships are a lot bigger than just two species. Sometimes it's one species with the entire ecosystem or the entire community it's part of. And what we call this very popular, important species is a keystone species. This is going to be the type of species that everybody needs, that everybody wants. A keystone species is worth preserving. And if you don't believe me, I mean, this is such a good example. So, in this study done looking at the Pacific Northwest, which is one of the most beautiful places on Earth, in my opinion, you have things called tide pools. And in these tide pools, you're going to have a lot of diversity of life. And sea stars are going to be found within that diversity of life. And just to emphasize how gosh darn important sea stars are to this diversity, this study took the sea stars out of the environment in this particular area. And what they found is 28 other species died when they took the sea stars out. Now, the one species that remained, because it took over, because the sea stars weren't there to consume them, was mussels. Mussels absolutely flourished and took over the entire habitat. So, if you put sea stars back in, you see those 28 other species coming back and thriving. Keystone species are so important. They are the more bang for your buck species when conserving biodiversity. They are so important. I cannot emphasize that enough. Other examples of keystone species are bison in the Kansas prairie. Beavers are also a keystone species for the way that they build dams. Elephants and lichens. I believe it's a specific kind of lichen. Desert lichens are also a keystone species. There's oodles more, but yeah, keystone species. Crazy important, guys. And with that, everybody, we hit the end of chapter 17. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. It was kind of a fun one, in my opinion. I really like talking about parasites and those different relationships. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out. And as always, make good choices.